Welcome, everyone. And tonight we are discussing the untapped Africa digital market and whether it can be leveraged for Africa in the global trade. And in the discussion tonight, we have three panelists. We have Chido, Rebecca, and Monica. We'll be speaking about different aspects of the Africa digital economy, from the digital divide that exists between Africa and the other economies, and then we'll be looking at whether opening up the African market might be advantageous to Africa, and in the sense that can Africa leverage that for global trade? So I will have each panelist introduce themselves, and then we will carry on with the discussion. So, Chido, you could introduce yourself, then Monica, you go next, and then Rebecca. Chido, welcome.
Thank you so much, Christian, for having me. My name is Chido Chashe Nicolette Niwe. I'm based in South Africa, but I'm Zimbabwean by nationality. And I am an international trade, investment, and business law enthusiast. I'm currently studying at the University of the Western Cape.
Thank you, Chido, for that. Monica, if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Monica Berimo. I am currently a student, an advocate trainee at the Kenya School of Law. I have an interest in international trade law, international investment law, and even digital law. So I'm very glad to be on this panel today, and I look forward to discussing some of the issues that we are going to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, and it's very nice to have you tonight. Rebecca?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Rebecca Njuguna. I'm a Kenyan based in South Africa, studying at the University of Cape Town. I'm in the area of information systems, where I'm carrying out research, and my particular interest is in ICT4D. So, in the digital market, digital economies currently is a hot topic on ICT4D and how Africa can leverage that. So, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca, for being here, and we look forward to having you. And so, if I could give a general perspective and give a few observations that have been made about Africa and the digital economy and the role that it plays on development in Africa. So, I'm quoting an article that notes that global inequality is connected to the topic of digital divide because technology is one aspect of material wealth, and wealth production is more and more based on technology and knowledge. So basically, the idea is that although we say that it's a globalized economy with digital divide across the different economies, that means the economies that are not participating fully in the global economy, because currently wealth production and material wealth is being driven by technology and knowledge. And then it's also noted that developing countries are not only economically excluded, but they're also deprived of political power, cultural skills needed for active participation in the information society. And ideally, same thing, for developing countries that do not have like much of the active participation in the tech world, then they are very much economically excluded from the global economy. So that's basically what we are looking at. And then the question is that appreciating that African economy on the digital side is not as developed, is it time to like open up the African economies for like other people to develop the digital side? What does that look like? Should this be leverage for Africa? And basically, that's the discussion we'll be having. We'll look at different aspects. But first, I will have Chido speak about this whole idea of the digital divide and what that really means and looks like for Africa. Chido?
Thank you so much, Christian, for that introduction. Very clear, and I do agree with the remarks that have been made that the continent is digitally excluded, and that obviously then affects its overall performance when it comes to economic development. And I will start by answering the question whether or not Africa should actually open itself to investment within for instance, the telecom sector, so that there is investment in ICT. I actually do think that's what we have to do, because some of the factors that are actually leading to the digital divide, I don't think we can deal with that alone as a continent without any other help. But on the other hand, I don't think that there is also, it's a quick fix situation where we have investors coming in and then they invest in our telecom sectors and our ICT sectors. And then the next thing, we have, we are now on the same level of development with other countries. So there are 4 factors that I genuinely would identify with the digital divide in Africa. And the first one being the socio-economic considerations. When we're talking about the socio-economic considerations, we're pretty much looking at how many people are able to afford tech mediums within the continent. And also, it also speaks to the idea of lack of internet access. So I will give an example of a research study that was conducted in 2019 by the OECD, which actually realized that only 10 out of 45 Africans could afford internet connectivity. And if you then look at the ratio from their salaries that they had to pay towards actually getting, that access to connectivity, it was such a huge chunk of their salaries. And I'll give you examples of countries like South Sudan, where you realize that only 7.78% of the whole population, I'm talking about a population of about 11 to 12 million people, have access to internet connectivity. That obviously then speaks to how those people are going to be alienated when we start talking about the digital economy. They can't reap the benefits of digital markets and all these other conversations that we're going to be having. Then you look at the weak infrastructure, which really is a problem that is across the continent. The level of internet penetration within the continent is actually very low when compared to other continents, right? So in 2019, it was actually considered that, the internet penetration rate in Africa was about 39.3%. And that's the lowest. The second lowest was actually Asia, which was sitting at 53.6%. And that's a very huge margin. Then we have Europe at 87.2%, and then North America in the 90s, actually at 94.6%. So obviously, these are the continents that have progressed when it comes to internet penetration. They're definitely going to be, reaping more benefits from the digital market as compared to the African continent. And that continuously then widens the gap of inequality, global digital inequality between Africa and all these other continents. So the infrastructural challenge really is something that we need to consider and address. And I think that's when we can start talking about, investment and having other people come in and invest in our infrastructure, in our, in capacity building, because even the literacy rate itself is a problem that is leading to the digital divide within the continent. Not many people actually are very much techno-savvy, if I could say. Not many people have the know-how, not only to use technology, but even to run technology at big tech companies. So I feel like we also then need investment when it comes to capacity building. And then the other thing that then really is so close to my heart, Kristen, relates to, internet shutdowns that are so rampant on the continent that are usually politically motivated. And I think that on its own becomes one of the big stumbling blocks, even when we start talking about foreign investment, because from an investor's perspective, you want to invest in a place that has got certainty, political certainty, economic certainty, social certainty. And I don't think that as far as we continue having these, random internet shutdowns by governments during elections or, civil uprisings, impending conflicts and all of these other things, that we can then really say we are in a better position to attract investment. We have had cases of countries like Uganda, like South Sudan. I mean, even in the sub-Saharan Africa, there are a lot of countries, Southern Africa, there are a lot of countries that have had to have these internet shutdowns. And I'll give an example of an internet shutdown that happened in Sudan, in which about 1.4 people were completely isolated from the digital economy. And I'm talking about, this does not only affect, day-to-day communication, but this affects even MSMEs that I have got, online businesses. This affects e-commerce in itself. So I feel like that is something that has to be addressed. And unfortunately, I don't think that the AU itself is actually doing so much to make sure that it deals with this whole issue of government interference. You have the AU Commission complaining about, how governments are shutting down internet, but not doing so much to make sure that that does not continue. In 2020, it was actually estimated that the continent lost about 2 billion in US dollars that could have otherwise been realized through the digital economy. And this money was lost as a result of these random internet shutdowns and cuts that the government really just do on whenever, because somebody doesn't agree with them. So I feel like those are the main issues that we need to deal with as a continent, because as you have rightfully pointed out, the inequality rate is there. And now we also have to then speak about gender digital divide, because that's also an issue. So you realize that we end up having to fight many battles because we are just lagging behind based on these other generic factors that I've highlighted. Thank you so much.
Shido, those are very good observations, and especially on the internet shutdowns, because one of the questions that Becky I will be asking you to comment on is, to what extent is political instability, culture negatively impacting on development of the Africa digital economy? And those are two things that you've touched on politics interfering and culture. Like for instance, the gender inequality. You find like most women might be more disadvantaged in accessing even internet because they cannot afford it. Or if, like for instance, in an earlier discussion that we had, someone was noting that if it's like within a home and one person has a phone, it mainly is not the woman who has it. Or if there's one who has to have a smartphone, it's mainly the man who has it. Or if there's money to spend, it's mainly the man who has the money to spend, which they will spend on the internet. So quite a lot to think about. So Becky, please, if you could contribute to this topic.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And Chido, you laid a good foundation on the main issues that are ailing us, and I totally agree with you, and especially on the issue of one of the things that is lacking being infrastructure. And I will divert and highlight another issue that I think is critical, and especially in terms of how politics and culture have impacted the speed of development and where we are now. And I just want to highlight a more existential thing with regards to how we view the inequality we find ourselves in and the history. So we are a continent that focuses a lot on raw production rather than knowledge. So the countries that we look up to, the countries that we refer to as developed, are mainly knowledge economies. And the difference is basically the premium that a nation places on information, how the information is gathered, how it informs decision making. So when I think about the culture and the politics, I think those two, it's like a chicken egg, what influences what. So let's just think about it. I'll just refer it to as culture. If you think about how decisions are made in Africa, there's very little emphasis that is placed on collecting data, learning from our history, because that is what would help us appreciate this is how things have been done before, and these are currently the ways that we could improve, or this is what we can keep. I think the current inequality is not even something I can blame on recent technologies. I don't think we've just lagged behind because of failing to adopt quickly to recent technologies. In my view, this is a problem that precedes global digitalization by far, in the sense that we simply haven't had the culture to document knowledge, to stop and reflect on how things have been done before, and then think about how we can improve them, while other countries have already been doing that, so that when these new technologies have become available, they moved very quickly to digitize their knowledge bases and accumulate the kind of skills that are needed to tap even more benefits from technological efficiency. We, on the other hand, haven't even figured out how to collect data, digitize it, and analyze it to gain insights that would allow us to propose solutions to our problems. And in addition to that, I highlight Chido's point to add that we lack both the infrastructure but also the value, like understanding the value of data. It's one thing to have technology. It's a totally different story to be guided by data, to even know how to make best use of this technology. When available data sets are not provided, like an institution is sitting on a data set, that would be very helpful to provide insights about maybe a group of people, but they hold on to that data such that it's not available to like NGOs that conduct research that would inform policy on digital transformation. So the other issue, the main issue is how our view of knowledge, documenting it and learning from it so that it can help us to build more efficient processes and utilize technology better. The second thing is I always find myself going back to education and how our curriculum is built in most countries. We have very poor thought and execution of curriculum, such that there is very low emphasis on encouraging creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So most curricula are geared towards the colonial and post-colonial agenda of you get educated, get a white-collar job, and a salary, and that's it. Rather than looking inward at your own capabilities and interests, the needs and opportunities around you and your community, and thinking about how do I innovate to solve this problem. So you still have the mentality. The mentality is still very rampant, where people in rural areas are thinking about how do I get educated and leave this place, because this place doesn't have utilities A and B. Instead of thinking, okay, we don't have water around here. How can we drill boreholes? How can we build dams? How can we install solar? How can we build greenhouses for all year farming? How can we automate these farming tasks that don't excite us because they're dirty? So we have a culture that has been fueled by that kind of curriculum, where we escape problems rather than buckling up and eradicating the problem. So we are not thinking in terms of, we don't even think ourselves as potential technologists. We just want easy solutions, like get a job, have another person do the dirty job, instead of thinking, okay, this is a process that can be mechanized using technology so that I don't sweat as much if sweating or getting dirty is what discourages you from doing it. So those are my views on the politics and culture. I just focused on the culture mainly. We don't place a premium on data and making decisions based on historical data and learning from mistakes and thinking about the future, taking time to reflect. But also the education system is just not doing us justice in terms of encouraging creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship.
That's such good contribution, Becky. And I think there is quite a lot you've said, and I will let Monica go next and speak generally about this topic of like Africa and the digital market and opening it up. And what, Monica, are your views on that?
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you, Rebecca and Chido, for those very knowledgeable insights. I think you have pretty much said everything that I was going to talk about. And I would just like to add that part of the problem that also contributes to this is the fact that Africans have not had enough time to catch up with the developed countries, owing to also the colonial divide that left many African countries impoverished, and they are only just trying to build themselves back up. And we can see this given the status of the international trade negotiations on the Doha round, which have stalled, especially in terms of e-commerce, because African countries are saying when they first came up with the agreement on the moratorium, in which the developed countries agreed that they were not going to put up tariffs on e-commerce trade, African countries or the least developed countries were not able to negotiate at that time. So this moratorium was being renewed every meeting, and it is still on. So what they're complaining about is that they are still trying to bridge the colonial gap that was created due to colonization. And here they are being faced with another problem, which is the digital divide. And this is another area in which they have the potential to emerge as global powerhouse countries. For example, South Africa, we can see Rwanda, we can see Kenya and Nigeria really taking up the mantle of being digital powerhouses in Africa. So African countries are basically crying foul from the developed countries that took part in the colonization. And I believe it's about time that in order to seal the colonization gap, we are supposed to take part in actively ensuring that the digital economy in Africa is properly regulated, is properly encouraged, and is enhanced the way Rebecca talked about in terms of education, in terms of innovation. And there are plenty of data that we're going to talk about later in the discussion that is going to point to the future of the digital economy and why it is very imperative for African countries to take part in developing themselves using the digital economy. So basically, that is it. And I look forward to the next session of the discussion in which we're going to get deeper into this matter.
Thanks a lot, Monica, for that. And yeah, quite a lot to think about looking at the past of where Africa is coming from. Even if I think that's a whole discussion on whether how far should Africa be saying colonialization is the reason why they can't develop their digital economy going forward, I mean, it's a live issue that we are dealing with as of today. So how much should we look at the past to as faulting our development today? But I'll come back to you, and I will quote again an article that notes that Ghana and South Africa are two of the 7 African countries that signed the WTO Telecommunications Agreement in 1997. The agreement requires countries to liberalize their telecommunications markets and to open these markets for foreign investors. This is the heart of the discussion. How much should Africa open their digital markets to foreign investors? And can Africa opening up the digital markets act as leverage for something else in global trade? So, like as Monica's pointed out, there are these deliberations that will happen at WTO, and Africa will be given, like most times, it's developing countries will be asking, be more lenient to us, to our products as we export them. But can this form part of the negotiation and as leverage for African countries? Chido, if you could generally speak about that.
So, it's a very sad reality coming from the quotation that you have just given about how Ghana and South Africa were the only African countries that actually signed the WTO Telecom Services Agreement. And if you then look at that, you wouldn't be very much surprised because I think it's becoming part of an African culture. Monica rightfully spoke of the e-commerce conversations within the WTO context, and how currently there is not even an e-commerce protocol yet. I mean, that's where we are now. There are so many conversations around the moratorium and how it should be extended and all these other things. And even if you then, look at that conversation from an African perspective, you then look at most of the other agreements that speak to generally e-commerce, digital economy, technology, how they are treated within the continent, you'd realize that we've always lamented how Africa has not yet ratified fully the Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection, which is very important, especially when we're talking about, digital markets, the digital economy, and all these other things. So I think there is just a general, unwillingness in Africa to have those conversations, to really embrace technology. And I think Becky tried to bring that conversation up. And going back to the WTO telecom services conversations, you'd realize that when the negotiations started, they never wanted to make it mandatory. It was always based on a voluntary basis. Joining the negotiating group was voluntary. And it was, like you said, mainly to open up telecom services markets, market access issues, and also the whole idea of foreign investment. So the other thing that maybe you haven't mentioned that I need to highlight that will probably explain why most African countries were not keen and are still not interested relates to the idea of competition laws and policies. So the telecom services sector in generally was monopolistic, right? So you realize that with this agreement and also moving through the decade and what has been happening, there has been introduction of competition into the sector. So when it was monopolistic, it was mainly to the benefit of governments. So now by having to open that to competition and allowing new entrants into the market and, foreign entrants into the market, it was always then going to be a bitter pill to swallow for African governments because they were generating so much revenue from the telecom service sector. If you look at the global market for that sector, you'd realize that it is probably worth over $1.5 trillion. That's in revenue. And for a long time, that revenue was just within governments, and it was not in any way getting to the private sector. That's when we have the agreement now, having commitments that include establishing new telecom companies that are necessarily not parastatals, having provisions for foreign direct investment in existing companies that are either parastatal and private. You have cross-border transmission of telecom services. And you would realize that even though it seems like it's a progressive step to take, especially for most African countries, they are still reluctant. Right now, only about 108 countries have made commitments to actually facilitate trade in the telecom services. And 99 have only committed to extend competition in telecom services. So there is still that whole idea of, monopoly that sort of clouds the whole sector. And I mean, that is fine. That I find very ironic because if you look at the state of most telecom sector, so to say, in most African countries, you'd realize that it's the most underdeveloped sector. I don't know if I had mentioned earlier that some of the countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, their telecom sectors are the least developed in the whole world, which then obviously begs the question that we might actually have to consider opening up the market, making sure that there is adequate market access for either new entrants that could be local or even foreign entrants, right? And then I wanted to point you to a different initiative that has been tried at regional level. So the AU tried to adopt, or rather adopted, the digital transformation strategy in February 2020, which also seeks to try and liberalize the market and try to gap the digital divide and also the gender digital divide, because those are issues that we can't alienate. But it's still far from reality. You see, it then comes back to this idea of, again, willingness. Yet we might want to start having honest conversations with ourselves concerning how much we actually are in need of investment. So the first thing that actually has to happen, whether countries run to ratify the agreement or not, or they decide to participate in the conversations or not, there is need to actually open up the sector. It doesn't have to be foreign investment. It just has to be investment. It could be, local investment. It could be foreign investment. But ultimately, the whole idea is Africa now has to open that market and allow new entrants to invest in, infrastructure, like we have been saying, invest in capacity building, and ensure that when that happens, there is that smooth transfer of technology, or what they call technological diffusion, which also is part of, this whole broader conversation about comparative advantage and all these things. But I still maintain that we have no other way, Christine, to deal with this than actually having to open our markets, the telecom market, to say.
Chido, those are very good observations. I mean, like in the telecom sector, a country like Ethiopia, the government has monopoly over the one telecom that is available to a majority of the people in Ethiopia. It's only recently that there is talk of the Kenyan Safaricom telecom that it might be able to get into the Ethiopian market at some point. But as you know, the monopolistic tendencies are quite a problem. Rebecca, I don't know what more you have to add to what Chido has to say on this.
I definitely agree. I totally agree with Chido that opening up for foreign investment is the way forward. And I think of transfer of technology as it's not always as much as we want to develop homegrown solutions to our problems. It's not always a wise thing to reinvent the wheel in all situations. And transfer of technology at the point where we are, we stand to gain a lot. And the example that comes to the top of my head is e-commerce. Right now, we know for a fact that e-commerce is the way to go. And it's well established in developed countries. The context may differ in terms of what products you prioritize and the payment mechanisms, but the core technology on which the ecosystems are built, how you build the marketplace to bring together the sellers, the buyers, the logistics handlers, those are things we can learn from. That the way they've already been built, those are technologies we can easily contextualize rather than build entirely from scratch. So all we need, and I think it's been highlighted before, the fact that even in the Africa Free Trade Area, the e-commerce protocol is still not fully fledged, fully developed. But if we work on the policy side, I think there is already enough underlying technology that we can learn from and easily contextualize. We just need to figure a few things out on the regulatory side to be able to take advantage of these and make sure we don't get the short end of the stick as we do the technology transfer, so that we don't pay too huge a cost than we ought to get to be able to derive the benefits. But transfer of technology, I definitely agree that it's the easiest way to make the leap forward.
Okay, thanks for that contribution, Becky. And so, Monica, let me ask, to what extent, like noting this, what has been observed, to what extent is the African population able to exploit the digital markets on their own? Considering the skills, the financial resources that are available to purchase requisite tech, hardware, and software, and also why does Africa not have the skills? Even as we are looking at, do we have the skills? Why do we not have the skills? And if we have no financial resources, why do we not have financial resources? I mean, there's a lot of minerals in Africa. Why can't some of those resources be invested into the digital economy, acquiring the hardware and the software needed? And also, if you could also speak about what will be the benefits and the challenges to opening up the digital economy to foreign investors.
Thank you so much, Christine. So, beginning with why we do not have resources, I believe it's because of poor political will and lack of incentive from the politicians in terms of implementation of policies, in terms of redistribution of money, redistribution of loans, redistribution of debts collected, and very high rates of corruption. As we all know, the African continent, in fact, recently issued, I think, by Transparency International, that placed Kenya among one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And this makes it difficult for people to access even the most basic of services, for example, justice and health and security. So, one of the reasons why there is a lack of resource in Africa, it is not because there is a lack of resource per se, but it's because the resources available are greatly being mismanaged and being misused by the politicians. And secondly, since the politicians do not have political will to actually see through the development of the digital trade in Africa, they have not put in place measures or implemented research that has been presented to them, telling them, hey, this is the percentage of people that do not have access to internet in Africa, and this is what you need to do to be able to increase this number. So we have seen that politicians are being presented on a day-to-day basis by very up-to-date studies, by very in-depth researchers that are trying to point towards the problem, but they do not have the political will to solve these problems. And I will give an example of my country once again. Just recently, people have suffered greatly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but the government has greatly insisted on making constitutional amendments that majority of the country feels is not appropriate in this time of economic turmoil. So we are seeing that there is resources, they want to take loans, they want to use money, but they're putting it in the wrong area. The UNCTAD report of 2020 indicates that the majority of the people that used to engage in trade on a face-to-face basis moved to online trading because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this number is likely to increase even post-pandemic. And so the UNCTAD Secretary General, the former Secretary General, Dr. Mokisa Kitui, recommended that the pandemic should awaken governments to a possibility in which they put themselves in a position to improve investment in their own countries by getting rid of investment bureaucracies that will prevent their populations from accessing critical technological investment and infrastructure that will enable African countries competition market. And concerning why there are no skills in Africa, Rebecca had already spoken about this, and this mainly goes on to the issue of education. The education system in Africa is highly historical, if I can put it that way, given that it was only recently, again, I'm going to use the example of my country, that Kenya introduced the competency-based curriculum in which students were being taught based on their own competencies and not on the traditional method of teaching students, imparting knowledge on them, and testing those who are able to pass and those who are not able to pass. So if we can redirect our education system to be able to include the teaching of students of digital skills and even the larger population on digital skills, it would be very critical for Africa it will be very beneficial for Africa in terms of allowing its population to effectively compete in the global market due to the resources that they have. And then on the final issue on to what extent the African population is able to exploit the digital market on their own, this comes to the question of the digital divide that has been the central point of our discussion today. So there are three types of digital divide, and the first one is the access divide, which basically refers to the infrastructure divide. And this is when there are countries that are developed that have the infrastructure, and then there's less developed countries, majority of them being African countries and South American countries that do not have infrastructure on the internet. The second type of digital divide is the use divide, and this is the inability. The people have access to internet, but majority of them do not know how to use it. There was a study by the International Telecommunications Unit that actually confirmed that in approximately 40 countries, half of the population does not know how to attach a document in an email. So this shows that people have access. Sometimes even in these developing countries, they have access to the internet, but they do not know how to properly make use of this internet. Then the final type of digital divide is the quality of use. So you have the internet, you have the infrastructure, you're able to access it, you have the digital skills, but you do not have enough quality of use of these materials. You're able to navigate the internet, but you're not able to make the most out of this. So to the extent that the African population can be able to exploit this digital market, it's going to rely primarily on governments taking incentives and taking active programs to ensure that these three types of digital divides are appropriately bridged in their population. And this is by first ensuring that there is infrastructure, and this is possible by redirecting funds into the development of digital infrastructure. And secondly, ensuring that their population has enough has enough skills to use the internet. And again, this goes to the education, from the basic level of education up to the tertiary level of education. They can be able to institute programs to enable their populations have adequate use of the internet. And finally, on the quality of use, the government can again invest in education to ensure that their populations are able to make the most out of the internet. And this includes in terms of research, innovation competitions, entrepreneurship awards, and allowing people to research and to publish academic material that would allow people to improve the quality of the benefits that they're reaping from the internet. I hope I have answered these issues, and I look forward to the feedback from the other members of the panel. Thank you.
Monica, you've addressed it perfectly, and thanks for that input that you've given. And I think as we are winding down the discussion, Chito, let me come back to you and hear what you have to say generally about this topic of like Africa and the resources that are available, and the lack of maybe interest or the skills to exploit the little internet access that we have, for instance. And you can generally make your final remarks on this topic, and then we can move on to Becky, and then Monica, and then we wind up the discussion.
Thank you so much. And I really do agree with everything that has been said earlier by Becky and Monica. Monica spoke about research and development within the continent, which I feel like is very important because it speaks to the issues of developing capacity. But I feel like the problem that we have when we look at research and development, you realize that in as much as there are a lot of papers that have been written about on Africa embracing technology. There are a lot of webinars that have been held. There are a lot of podcast sessions, but people are generally lack interest in that. And I think access to technology for a long time has not been a first generation right. And if you look at the state of most African countries, they are still struggling to access the fundamental human rights, right? We're talking about first generation rights. But now, if you look at the way at which digitalization is accelerated, you would realize that soon enough, the right to actually be on the internet or have access to the internet is fast becoming a first generation right, in the sense that it is then that access actually then helps realize the other first generation rights. It helps, it helps governments be able to even promote and safeguard the fundamental human rights. So in actual fact, I would almost suggest that it be a human right if it's not a human right. Then I wanted to speak on the issue of incubation, right? So I noticed that with most of these other startups within the fintech space, there's a lot of incubation that happens within the already existing financial services, businesses or enterprises. So these new entrants these entrants into the market are incubated to cushion them and help deal with all those resolves that relate to, capital and finances and a lot of all these other things. And I feel like that's also the same thing that government has to do. Government has to incubate any other business or any other innovative idea that comes from anybody that in a way helps bridge the digital divide or helps elevate the literacy or the digital illiteracy within the continent, whatever that it contributes to this whole discussion. I feel like there needs to be a lot of incubation. And I'll give you an example of Malaysia. It actually did that during the COVID-19 pandemic period, that the government itself literally had to set aside funds to incubate all these other innovative ideas and, products that help with digitalization. And I feel like that's a very good thing. Another thing, I want to speak briefly on why we keep having the same conversations and there seem not to be any change. Mainly because the question that most policymakers have to ask is how they stand to benefit. So the reason why the telecom sector is not developed or there is not much of market access within, or it's closed and there is monopoly, is because there are people who still get to benefit from that monopolistic tendency. When then there is competition or markets have been opened, they've been liberalized, there is not so much that people benefit. So I feel like we need to move away from that mentality that we just have to benefit without benefiting the greater populace. So I like what the United States of America also seems to be like. It's United States first. Let it be a culture that we start cultivating in ourselves as future leaders, as policymakers today, that we put the people first. We put economic development first. we put development generally first, because when we then look at development from the point of Amata said, you realize that it's an all-inclusive term that speaks to political, social, economic, and socio-economic development. So we need to put development first, African development first, the Africa we want first. And I feel like we can be then in a position to make regulatory changes and policy changes that actually impact development generally. And this also then speaks to, digitalization and all these other conversations. But at the same time, I don't feel like it's so bleak for the continent, because in as much as governments are not giving people much to work with, the people themselves that are within the continent are trying so hard to try and capitalize on these opportunities and, bridge the gap. We look at the corporate sector. We look at most telecom companies that, well, I'm not going to speak about state-owned, but I'm going to talk about private-owned entities. In Zimbabwe, we have got Econet. It's a private-owned company. Aside the issues of, competition and how there is egalitarian and all these other things, it has actually managed to bridge the gap in Zimbabwe to an extent. There are a lot of incentives that come with that business. There is a lot of incubation that is happening. And also you'd realize that they were actually stepping up to try and ensure that there is financial inclusion for the financially excluded. We now have, we can have conversations about mobile money platforms that are actually being run by independent independent companies within the corporate sector. So I feel like we need to also then consider that. And during the COVID pandemic, you realize that most people stepped up. Businesses had to reinvent themselves because the government-induced lockdowns to try and curtail the spread of the virus literally meant that the whole world was on standstill. The whole continent was on standstill. People couldn't go to work. They couldn't go to school. And all these other services could not be easily accessible. But you have businesses trying to reinvent themselves, even SMEs, even the micro businesses within the continent had to reinvent themselves to make sure that they catch on to this wagon of e-commerce and digitalization. So I feel like what we then now need at the end of the day is government support. So I'm going to put the burden on the government. The government has the burden of proof actually in this matter, government, so to say, to make sure that they help in bridging or in dealing with this digital inequality. Because as far as the common man is concerned in Africa, I feel like they are doing way much more to try and, catch on to the wagon and fully digitalize. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Christian.
Chido, those are very good remarks, and we will follow up on some of the points that you raised there in your discussion, especially on the incubators and also like the role that the government should be playing. And again, you go to things like governments now have decided to start taxing the digital economy in all manner of ways within Africa. So you wonder what should be the best approach at this point. Rebecca, if you could also make your final remarks on the topic.
I think my opinions are brief, but it's a mixed reactions of both feeling hopeful in terms of there is an effect from COVID-19 that is going to stick, and because COVID forced businesses, everyone, big, large and small scale businesses, to digitize very quickly as far within their capacities, and some of that effect is likely to stay. So that's a good thing, because we are likely to experience what we've been talking about. We have potential to leapfrog some stages, or we didn't invest so hard in technology that has been deemed archaic now. So now we have the chances to just plug into the recent technologies. But the other side is that I don't feel very confident in terms of the speed at which the digital transformation is happening. I feel like the public sector, who have a huge mandate of regulating and coming up with some of the frameworks that would allow this digital transformation to be flawless, and especially in terms of when you're talking now about the African market being one, you're talking about the tax issues there, you have remittances there, you have data privacy. So that's the side where I'm a bit apprehensive, because looking at the kind of hesitancy, and Chido has talked about it, we don't see a lot of proactiveness in having these policies in place. And that could be a huge, huge issue, especially when you think about the kind of exposure that moving people who are not historically very literate, forget about technological literate, moving them suddenly to a digital space I'm a bit apprehensive. Like this, I don't feel like the regulators are keeping up with the rate of digitization, and that could be very costly in terms of cybercrime. So that's the part where I feel I'm happy about. Like this year has been very productive. 2021 alone, we are not even 6 months in, but the amount of foreign investment that has come in into high growth startups that are coming up with solutions to African problems in every area you can think of, every industry. You have e-learning, telemedicine, agriculture. So I feel excited on one end, but on the other end, those are people in the non-profit and private sector. But I don't feel like the public sector and the regulators are keeping up, and that could potentially be a big problem. So I think my ending remarks is that I feel I have mixed feelings about where we are.
Thanks a lot for that, Becky. Quite some good observations there on the regulation side, and much truly needs to be done. Monica, if you could give your closing remarks on the topic.
Thank you, Rebecca and Chido, for your comments. I completely agree. And my final comments would be to greatly recommend to governments, especially now, and they are supposed to see through actively the realization of phase 2 and phase 3 of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement concerning intellectual property, investment, competition, and e-commerce, to hasten it the way Rebecca has talked about, to hasten the process to ensure that by the time it comes out, it is not too late for them. Secondly, I would also recommend to governments to participate in the ongoing discussions in the WTO concerning the investment facilitation and the initiative on e-commerce. Given that the Doha round has not come into completion, it would be a waste of time to wait for it to come to completion while other countries are concluding trilateral agreements that are likely to affect the international scope of trade in e-commerce and digital space. So they're supposed to take advantage of this and not keep complaining that they are far behind, and just jump into the agreement and understand as much as they can and seek to have their interests secured. So for individual businesses, I would recommend that the businesses invest in technologies, especially digital technologies that would enable them reduce their trade costs. They're supposed to take advantage of new trade technologies, including digital platforms. The businesses that are still operating face to face, it is high time that they start shifting towards trading, if not both face to face and digitally. They should trade completely digitally, because it will reach a time where a majority of businesses will be trading online. So they're supposed to take advantage of these new platforms. Individual businesses are also supposed to drive for policy change that is favorable for the implementation of technologies, and this includes the private sector going hand in hand with government policymakers and ensuring that their interests are taken into account in situations of policy making and policy change. So if they do not take advantage of policy decisions, they may be locked out of critical decisions that are likely to affect them. For example, the digital tax. If the private sector could have come in and negotiated this properly, perhaps it would have taken a different direction. And for governments as well, they are supposed to ensure that they remove the obstacles to technological trade and employ regulatory changes that would facilitate the application of technology in various areas of digital trade. And they should also prioritize investment in digital infrastructure, like we have talked about, open up their borders to international investment, ensure that their local and international investors are well protected, and they should also ensure that digital regulations are internationally streamlined. This goes back again to the WTO Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce and digital platforms. And then finally, concerning this whole digital divide and how to bridge the gap, I would recommend to individual persons, including you and I, to make sure that we take advantage of the available digital learning opportunities. There are so many courses online that teach people how to code, that teach people how to trade digitally, that teach people how to create online social following that would enable them gain an advantage in terms of trading. So I would recommend that each one of us take it upon ourselves to understand and reduce the weak link that is often attributed to human beings when it comes to issues of technology. So I thank all of my panel members for having given their wonderful insights, and I look forward to seeing the future that the African continent is going to portray in terms of the digital trade. Thank you so much, Christine.
Okay, thanks a lot, Monica, for your contribution tonight. And thank you, Chido. Thank you, Rebecca, for the contributions that you've made. These discussions, we hope the person listening to them later on, you can leave comments and give any feedback on, and also more importantly, take this information and act on it. But also, I think a main thing that I would like to mention is that change of mindset is important for like the governments and the policymakers across Africa. We've had discussions in the past, like with Becky, about like 3D printing, how that's going to change the whole landscape of manufacturing. And governments and policymakers need to realize this is something that's happening. So when someone is planning on where to invest, they need to think how the investments that they are making today will be affected by that. So also, for instance, we are speaking about self-driving trucks with Chido, and we were noting that, for instance, the design of roads right now, the government should change their mindset and realize that any even brick and mortar investment today will be affected eventually by what the fourth industrial revolution is going to impact, the impact that it will have. So thank you everyone for this discussion tonight. We will have future discussions on the digital economy and the digital market in Africa. And for our listeners, and you realize that this topic of the digital market and the digital economy we have it so often in this forum, but it's because that's really is the future of where Africa should be looking and be planning around. Thank you everyone for listening tonight, and we all will say good night. And whenever you listen to this, may you have a nice rest of your day or night.